Selecting what vegetables to grow can be a difficult task for many of us who want to grow our own food. For some people, especially those who are just starting to learn how to grow, there can often be a question about what is possible or appropriate and how to do it. For more experienced growers, it can be more of a task of figuring out how to fit everything that we want to grow into the limited space that we have. I definitely find myself in this second category, and over the years I've settled on a basic planting plan and crop rotation for most of the family scale gardens that I'm experimenting with. In general, these plans work quite well, except for the Brassica family crops, which every season I want to grow more of. But fitting in more of these abundant and useful crops means that I have to sort out some potentially problematic issues and constraints, and I'm still not sure how best to deal with this dilemma. Brassicas are an amazingly diverse and useful group of crops that grow really well in this climate. And they're also the crops that have the most issues with a number of problematic pests, and the dreaded Brassica clubroot disease is something that I definitely want to avoid. It's because of diseases like this, and a few other reasons, that I decided to follow the general advice for establishing a crop rotation system from the start. For most of the gardens, I kept all of the Brassica family crops in one quarter of the garden, and rotated the sections each year for 4 years before the brassicas were grown in the same soil again. This separation of crop families or groups into different sections of the gardens definitely made it easier to sort out the planting plans for the overall gardens, but it was a bit trickier in the Brassica section. Some of these plants, such as Brussels sprouts, are quite long season plants and occupy the space in the gardens from late spring through into winter. But other plants, like broccoli, are only occupying the bed in the gardens for part of the growing season, and I'm always tempted to get in another fast-growing brassica crop, such as rocket or radishes, into the space before or after this main crop. And if I wanted crops like kohlrabi or turnip, as well as the diversity of salad greens throughout the season, then I really needed to dedicate a part of the brassica rotation to growing a succession of these faster-growing brassica plants. But this meant that I was growing one brassica plant after another in the same space, which didn't seem to make sense from a crop rotation standpoint. But I wonder if all this segregation and concern about rotation is really worth it. As far as I can tell, the main reason for doing it is to avoid the buildup of clubroot spores in the soil, the phase of this disease that can apparently remain dormant in the soil for many years. It is a debilitating disease and quite common, and apparently once you have it in the soil, it can be very difficult to get rid of, if not impossible. Thankfully, I have no experience with this fungal disease, but the research that I have done indicates that 4-year rotation is probably good enough, but 6 or more years may be needed between brassica crops to prevent reinfection. And my gardens are really quite small, at least compared to the field-scale operation where this type of crop rotation was developed for. So even with the rotation, the crops are only just beside where they would have grown the season before. I could easily be moving the spores from one bed to the other with tools or on my boots. But I don't have this disease in my gardens yet, so perhaps I shouldn't worry so much about it until I do get it. And because I sow all my own seeds and never buy in transplants, I have reduced the risk of importing the spores from elsewhere. And it seems that this disease is much less common in alkaline soils, and the calcareous soils that I grow in have a naturally high pH of around 7.5. So perhaps this is something that I should not be so worried about in my context, or at least not base my planting plans for the gardens on preventing a disease that is less likely. But there are other reasons to want to segregate the crops into one section of the garden, and preventing damage by pests is one of the main reasons that I concentrate on with the brassicas. Caterpillars have been a problem in my gardens, and I've found the best way to deal with them is to cover all the Brassica family crops, which means covering 1/4 of the garden with netting, or some other form of crop cover. This prevents the butterflies from laying their eggs on the leaves of the plants, which avoids the infestation of the leaf-chomping caterpillars several weeks later. There are other approaches to dealing with this pest, but if I don't cover the crops, I've only really relied on regularly examining the plants and squishing any eggs or caterpillars that I can find. And if I can catch them early enough, then I can prevent a lot of damage. But this is a lot of work and needs to be done quite frequently. The netting that I started to use this season seems to work really well, and unlike the other covers that I've used in the past, it allows me to see into the crops and keep an eye on things. This type of netting is also very useful for keeping the birds away from the crop, especially the wood pigeons that can cause real damage to the plants in the winter. So I try to keep the brassica plants covered at all times throughout their growth in the gardens, and it is a lot easier to do this if the brassicas are all kept together in one area, which is what I've done in 3 of the gardens. But in the polyculture garden, I've started to mix the larger brassicas in with the other crops, and if I was to cover all of them with netting, I would end up covering at least 4 of the 6 beds. This would have made it a lot more difficult to manage and harvest from the other intercropped plants, and I would have spent a lot of time lifting and recovering the netting, so this season I decided to not cover them and to see what happened. And we've had to pick off a lot of caterpillars, especially from the kale, broccoli, and Brussels sprout plants, which has taken a lot of time, and it would have been a lot easier and faster to cover all of the beds from the start of the season. But perhaps I don't need to cover all of the brassicas, as the faster growing plants like radishes, turnip, and rocket don't seem to be as bothered by the caterpillars. Perhaps they are less attractive to the butterflies, or they are just so fast growing that the caterpillars never get a chance to become a problem. It seems that these crops that aren't bothered by the caterpillars for whatever reason are often really badly affected by another significant pest, the flea beetle. This pest doesn't seem to have much of an impact on kale and the other larger brassicas that I grow first as transplants, which seem to be large enough when they're planted into the gardens to more successfully outgrow the possible damage by these tiny beetles. But any of the Brassica family of plants that I direct sow into the gardens typically end up with lots of tiny holes from these flea beetles, and with a bad infestation they can significantly damage the plants, and definitely turn an otherwise edible leaf into something a lot less appealing. Covering these direct sown crops with a much finer mesh can help to a certain extent, but I suspect that the edge of the netting or fleece needs to be buried in the soil to prevent the small beetles from simply crawling under the edge of the material. And it definitely doesn't work if the flea beetles are already in the soil of the bed that I'm covering, which I've done in the past, where I've simply trapped them in with the seedlings. So it seems that it would be better to not plant any of these direct sown brassicas in with the rotation of other Brassica family plants, and ideally they should probably be in a bed that didn't have brassicas grown in them in the previous season. This potential separation of the Brassica family of crops into 2 separate parts is an added complication for the planting plan that I've been using for the last number of years, and I'm still trying to sort it out. I have had some issues with other pests in the past, including the Cabbage Root Fly, whose larvae can really damage the roots of Brassica family plants, but I haven't noticed much of an issue with this pest lately. Perhaps this is because I had been using crop covers with a finer mesh to prevent the caterpillar damage, and that this had helped to keep out the flies as well. It is possible with the recent switch to using a netting with bigger holes for these crops could mean that the cabbage root fly might become a problem again, and this is something that I need to watch out for. Slugs are also a problem with some of the Brassica family plants, especially the cabbages this season, and unfortunately the less transparent crop covers make it harder to notice the damage. While the larger netting makes it easier to keep an eye on things, it still serves as a physical and psychological barrier, which means that I check for slugs less often than I would otherwise. The netting would also keep out any natural predators of slugs, including hedgehogs and frogs, and it would also keep out the ducks if I ever got ducks to control the slugs. I think this is an interesting example about a method that I use to control one pest could limit the options that I can use for managing other pests. And it's not always easy to figure out the best solution. So, I want to grow more Brassica family crops because they seem to do so well in this context, and some of the faster growing crops in the family are more useful for growing either before or after other main crops. But in order to do this, I need to abandon some of the rules that I've been following, or at least develop new approaches. It seems that maintaining a crop rotation to avoid disease buildup isn't so important in the context of these gardens, but it might be something that I need to revert to if a soil-borne disease becomes a problem. It is still useful to grow all of the larger brassicas in one section of the garden so that they are easier to protect from caterpillars and birds, or I need to cover a lot more of the garden with netting, or to find methods of dealing with pests that work just as well. And perhaps it would be better to grow the radishes, turnip, and brassica salad greens that are direct sown in other sections of the gardens, away from the larger brassica plants, in order to reduce the damage of flea beetles. This could really work if I was able to fit in these fast-growing crops before or after the main crops in these beds. But in order to have some of these useful and abundant crops during the main part of the growing season, they would have to displace other crops, which I'm hesitant to do. The easiest answer to all of this is to simply increase the size of the garden, to have more space to grow more crops. But that's not really an option for these gardens and for many people. There are other issues that I should probably consider in figuring out how to fit more brassicas into the gardens, including soil fertility, and that these strong and aggressive plants can have large root systems that can impact plants growing beside them. And there are also possibilities of mutually beneficial or antagonistic relationships with other types of plants, but this only adds a complexity of working everything out. And one thing that I am learning is to try to figure out how to prioritize issues, and to avoid making decisions or continuing to use methods that are based on factors that are not so relevant in my context. This isn't always easy, and it can involve a fair amount of trial and error. But these days I feel that a lot of the brassica crops that I'm growing are quite healthy and productive, so I must be doing something right, and I'm becoming less concerned about possible disease issues. So a lot of my focus has shifted to using methods and materials to reduce the risk of pest damage to these crops, and to buy in the materials and to do the work of covering and uncovering the beds where necessary. This is extra work and is a key factor for deciding how to fit in all these crops into the gardens, but it is a lot easier and less time-consuming than dealing with the caterpillars by hand. And it also increases the quantity and quality of the food that I'm able to harvest from the gardens. Or at least it increases the possibilities that the plants that I do grow will produce something that I would want to eat, which is kind of the point of this whole exploration.